Good evening, everyone. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to the inaugural launch of Duty to Country, A Broken Promise. My name is John Malagrito, Executive Secretary of the Filipino Veterans Recognition and Education Project, or PhilVetREP, and I will be your host this evening. But first, let's acknowledge our distinguished guests. Philippine Veterans Affairs Office, Manila, Philippines, Lieutenant General Ernesto Carolina, Administrator. Army Historical Foundation, General Eric Shinseki, U.S. Army Retired, and Lieutenant General Roger Schultz, U.S. Army Retired President. National Museum of the U.S. Army, Ms. Tammy Call, Director. Pritzker Military Museum and Library, Dr. Rob Havers, President and CEO, and Major General James Mukuyama, U.S. Army Retired. National World War II Memorial, Ms. Holly Rotondi, Executive Director, and Lieutenant General David Hantun, U.S. Army Retired. Smithsonian National Museum of American History, Ms. Jennifer Jones, Curator. Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, Dr. Lisa Sasaki, Executive Director. U.S. Military Academy Museum, Dr. David Reel, Director. MacArthur Museum, Mr. James Zubel, Director. Ms. Monalisa Yuchenko, Founder and Chair, Philippine International Aid Corporation, Sponsor. Mr. Tony Olaez, Founder and President, ODM Mart, Corporate Sponsor. Mr. James Yap, Project Sponsor. Chinese American Veterans of World War II Recognition Project, Major General Bob Lee, U.S. Army Retired, and Mr. Ed Gore. National Veterans Network, Ms. Christine Yamazaki Sato, Executive Director. We're delighted to have you with us this evening. It has been more than 7 years since PhilVetREP came together to create a national campaign to raise national awareness about the service and sacrifice of Filipino and American World War II veterans. This campaign led to their national recognition when the U.S. Congress honored them with the Congressional Gold Medal on October 25, 2017. That was our first priority, and we accomplished it with tremendous support from members of Congress, community leaders, charitable organizations, families and friends, and many, many dedicated volunteers. Our next priority was to develop an online interactive educational program to preserve our veterans' historic legacy. Today, we are very proud to present what we have accomplished in pursuit of our historic mission. Members of the team that helped put together this powerful and compelling story of American history are here with us tonight. They will be providing an overview of Duty to Country and the way ahead in this campaign. I will be introducing them in the course of this program. And now, friends, it is my honor and privilege to introduce General Antonio Taguba, the National Chairman of the Filipino Veterans Recognition and Education Project. Himself a son of a Filipino World War II veteran and a staunch advocate of veterans' rights. He has been the driving force of this historic mission since PhilVetREP was formed in 2013. General Taguba.
Thank you, John, for that great introduction, and good evening, everyone. My sincere thanks to our guests for joining us on this epic moment in launching Duty to Country, a Broken Promise Education Project. It is truly fortuitous that we proudly present Duty to Country to you as we commemorate victory over Japan, the 75th anniversary of the end of the war in the Pacific, and on the eve of Veterans Day on November 11th. Now, even on this dire pandemic period, we want this occasion to help give us some measure of excitement, of unity, hope, and pride in telling the untold stories of thousands of heroes who were deprived of recognition and were discounted of their wartime service. I am reminded of Abraham Lincoln's inspiring words in March 1865, and I quote, "To care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan." His words were meant to exemplify the interminable consequences of war upon the citizen soldiers and their families in protecting our freedom at home. Now, I share these words with you to reflect on the honor of service of American soldiers who serve under the American flag. I had thought these solemn words could have fallen on the shoulders of Filipino men and women who served under the American flag during World War II. But sadly, they did not apply to them. The words did not apply to them, nor to their families, because they were not American citizens. They were U.S. nationals under colonial law or rule. Now, this project was inspired by the storied history of Filipino and American veterans of World War II. In July 1941, General Douglas MacArthur commanded the U.S. Army Forces of the Far East, comprised of thousands of Americans and Filipinos who fought against the Japanese invaders and were victorious in ending the war in September 1945. But their glory was short-lived after the war when they were presented with the Rescission Acts of 1946, a least-known congressional act that took away the identity, honor, and dignity of some 260,000 Filipino soldiers and guerrillas who fought and died in defense of the United States. There were much more untold and hidden stories beyond that war that needed to be chronicled in revealing half a century of oppression against the Philippines, the Filipino of the Philippines, the people of the Philippines. Now, I recall what Mr. Celestino Almeida said on October 25, 2017, when he was presented the Congressional Gold Medal, and I quote, "I have waited with my Filipino and American soldiers for this moment to come. Thousands of us felt underappreciated and unrecognized for fighting for our country. We often wondered why and what else we could have done in defending the United States. We stayed loyal to our country. We accomplished our mission with our lives, our wounds, and those still missing in action." End quote. He is 103 years old today and still with us. Another is Mr. Jesse Baltazar, who fought in 3 wars, the Philippines, Korea, and Vietnam. And before he passed away in April 2016, he asked me how much longer will he and his fellow veterans would have to wait for America to recognize them. The Congressional Gold Medal Act was signed by President Obama on the 7th December 2016. And Mr. Jack Tejeda would often wear a suit and walk the halls of Congress almost every day to greet members of Congress and their staff as his way to remind them why and his band of brothers needed their help. He died in 2008 without getting his pay or benefits. We are so proudly presenting to you part 1 of an interactive education project replete with incredible and unexplainable stories and facts from living veterans, from families, and discovery of hundreds of historical accounts and artifacts that were filed away at the National Archives, the Library of Congress, and family records. When they were told of the Rescission Act, they organized and protested peacefully, marched in front of the White House, pleaded their case for recognition in front of Congress and in the halls of the Supreme Court. All the while, their fellow veterans passed away without knowing the country they pledged to defend would grant them the promise of entitlements and recognition. They shared an extraordinary spirit of unshakable faith and purpose of hope that America will acknowledge them as equal members of the greatest generation. They found champions for their cause in Congress, in Senator Daniel Inouye, Senator Daniel Akaka, who were World War II veterans themselves, and with Congressman Norman Mineta on their quest towards U.S. citizenship. In some instances, they were able to provide relief, but the majority of Congress were not amenable to repealing the Rescission Act. Therein lies the albatross, their punishment bestowed upon these noble men and women who willingly fought and died for their country. Now we, as their children and grandchildren, took action to fight for their rights and educate America on their contribution to our nation's heritage and to what duty to country meant to them with their profound and unwavering loyalty to the United States, even when they were dishonored, betrayed, and discriminated against for over 75 years. Now, volunteers of the Filipino Veterans Recognition and Education Project made a solemn commitment to the veterans and their families to create a dynamic platform as their virtual voice and why they are relevant in American history, and for their legacy to be known and be heard, to be respected and remembered. They did not want to be left behind. There are some 10,000 living veterans remaining in the Philippines and the United States, all in their late 90s, and very few over 100. The ranks are dwindling, and they're still hoping for some relief. There's no greater honor and respect America can bestow to soldiers for their patriotic duty to bear arms and defend their fellow citizens with their lives and wounds. Duty to country is a promise we made and we will not break. And this is our way of repaying an eternal debt of gratitude. Now, this is our unfinished work in American history. We have more to tell in the next phases of duty to country. We will accomplish it for the sake of the veterans and their families. Lest we forget, they did serve under one flag, that of the United States of America. Thank you.
Thank you, General Taguba. Indeed, duty to country is a promise we cannot afford to break. An overview of this project will now be presented by a member of our team, Professor Chris Caposola. He is a professor of history at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he teaches classes on political and legal history, war and the military, and the history of immigration. He has just published a book, Bound by War: How the United States and the Philippines Built America's First Pacific Century. I encourage all of you to get a copy of this book. Professor Caposola.
Good evening. Thank you, John, for that excellent introduction. Thank you, General Taguba, for guiding us in the beginning of this conversation. And in particular, thank you all for joining us online this evening as we launch the Duty to Country Educational Project. General Taguba has given us a brief account of the work of PhilVet-Rep and our efforts first to recognize Filipino and American soldiers and servicemen, and then through the Duty to Country exhibition to educate people about this history. Now, I'd like to take a moment to give you a history of our history, of the work that we did, how we came together to mount the Under One Flag digital exhibition, and some of the lessons we think that it teaches, and from there, some of the work that remains to be done. For me, Duty to Country brings history to life. And I'll start with a personal story. As John Mellegrito mentioned, I just finished writing a book. And as I did my research, I had heard some of these legendary names, like Major General Antonio Taguba. At the Library of Congress, I read the memos of Capitol Hill staffers who fought urgently, pressing for equity legislation. And I saw once in a while the name Marie Blanco. And as I read about the efforts of organizers who took to the streets and organized in community halls and communities all across the country, I found sometimes in the archives the curled up old fax papers sent by a young John Mellegrito. And in the records of courts, I saw the filings of lawyers such as Seth Watkins, who advocated for veterans and their families. But I never imagined that I would actually get to meet these people that I was researching. And then history came to life, thanks to a personal connection made possible by Dawn Mabalon, the distinguished scholar, herself the daughter of a veteran, lost to us too young, and who is with us in spirit this evening. When through Dawn, I met PhilVet-Rep, I joined them, and we rolled up our sleeves and we got to work. And we created, among other things, the Duty to Country Education Project and the Under One Flag digital exhibition that you'll see this evening. And as it did for me, I hope that Duty to Country brings history to life for visitors to the site. We knew that this history was important for three main reasons. First, we knew the importance of documenting this history, getting it down and getting it right. That it was all too often that people had said to us, I was never taught this history in school. And I think all of us involved in this project are tired of hearing that. And so instead of just sort of hearing it, we decided to change the history, to rewrite it and to tell this story and to get it down and to do so before it was too late. It's been an honor and a privilege to meet some of the Filipino World War II veterans in the course of this project, to record their stories and to preserve them for the future. We knew it was important for veterans and their families to see their history represented and that it be done so on their terms and in their own words. And third, we wanted to share this legacy and bring it to life for new generations of Americans, and particularly to meet them where they are, to meet young people online through an attractive and dynamic website that was at the same time historically sound. And I think that that's what the Duty to Country Education Project and the Under One Flag digital exhibition do. Now, because I'm a history professor, I'm going to take some time right now for a little history lesson. And I promise you at the end, there's no quiz, so don't worry. But I wanted to just show some images first. And you'll see more of these in just a moment. And if I can't get it to work, I'm just going to, okay. I'm not going to show the slides, but I'll tell you 4 key lessons that I think that you'll encounter as you work through the Duty to Country exhibition over the course of this evening. First, we recognize that the story of Filipinos fighting for their rights and for a better future is a long history. That from the moment when people gathered in Malolos in the Philippines for the Philippine Republic to declare its independence in 1898, all the way to the present. For decades, Filipinos and Filipino Americans have been fighting for their individual freedom and their national political rights. They did this on the battlefields of the Pacific War, and then again on the streets, in courtrooms, and in the legislative halls of the United States. Second, we understand that the Philippines was and remains an enduring part of American history. For 48 years, the Philippines was a colony of the United States. That relationship transformed transformed both countries and built lasting connections between the two nations. And we see that this continued even after independence in 1946. That the Philippines joined together with the United States to play a crucial role in the global Allied struggle against fascism in World War II and in the years after. As soldiers, guerrillas, or civilians, Filipinos liberated their homeland. Third, we learn of the long history of America's broken promises to the Philippines and to the Filipino people. Even after the Philippines obtained its independence in 1946, the United States turns its back on the very people who had helped them defeat the Japanese Empire. Racial prejudice was written into law and erased the wartime service of some 200,000 service members who fought under the American flag. This history reminds all of us of the importance of upholding the principles of justice, fairness, equality, for which Americans and Filipinos fought so hard and sacrificed so much. Finally, we learn from the post-war struggles of veterans, their families, and their advocates that ordinary people can change the law by speaking out, by educating others, and by patiently building broad bipartisan coalitions. Filipino World War II veterans and their advocates rewrote history and changed the law. To me, this is a crucial lesson, all the more so on a night like tonight, when so many Americans are distrustful of those on the other side of the aisle, disillusioned with the political process. The history in Duty to Country shows all of us, particularly young people, how we can still get things done together. That task, especially as Veterans Day approaches next week, remains for us to honor all of that history and to carry on that fight. because history is still alive, just as it was when I walked into the room and met John Mellegrito and Marie Blanco and Antonio Taguba and so many of the veterans who gave us their stories. As we compiled these, I marveled at the things that ordinary men and women did during the Second World War and in the decades that followed. I also had a chance to feel the way that history is still alive with us. As the Duty to Country team worked on the exhibition, we received emails late in the night from John Mellegrito, filled with all of the same passion that motivated him to organize veterans to call Americans to settle their debts. When we wrote about the early failures to win veterans legislation in the 1980s, 1990s, we learned from Marie's thoughtful reflections that disappointment is still very much alive. Early on in this project, I shared with the PhilVet rep team more broadly, President Harry Truman's signing statement that accompanied the Rescission Act that he very reluctantly signed in February 1946, the law that stripped Filipino World War II soldiers of their access to US benefits. In it, Truman reminded Americans of the nation's, quote, moral obligation to provide for the heroic Philippine veterans who sacrificed so much for the common cause. In a message to me, one of the PhilVet rep volunteers, Christy Poiseau, told me that those words bring her to tears every time she hears them. We learn from her, from the veterans, from their descendants, that the stakes of our work are high and that the amount of time that remains for us is low. It is not the feelings alone that are still alive. Nearly 75 years after President Truman's statement, we remain under that moral obligation. On behalf of all of us here this evening, we offer Duty to Country as partial payment on a long overdue debt. Thank you, and back to you, John.
Thank you, Professor Capossala, for your excellent work in bringing history to life, to get it down, and as you aptly put it, to get it right. And now, to the part you've all been waiting for. What does Duty to Country look like? Night Kitchen Interactive is an award-winning design firm with 20-plus years of experience partnering with museums, science centers, and arts and cultural heritage organizations. We have been privileged to partner with this design company, spending countless hours over the last few weeks to make sure we accomplish our goal with flying colors. It is my pleasure to introduce Matthew Fisher, founder and principal of Night Kitchen Interactive, who will now walk us through the design and content of Duty to Country. Matt Fisher.
Thanks, John, and thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to also thank the PhilVet rep team for inviting us to partner with them on this project. When I first learned about this project from General Taguba, I was intrigued, but I had no idea just how compelling the story would be and to what extent it would change not just my understanding of the history of the Philippines and World War II, but American history. Before I start my presentation, I'd like to take a moment to share with you my experience of working with the PhilVet rep team. Some of the key themes to come out of our early discussions were honor, duty, patriotism, sacrifice, in a word, heroism. When I was in high school, I was asked to write an essay about a hero who inspired me personally. I really struggled with that essay, and in the end, I chose a different topic. As a child of the 70s in America, I was drawn to stories of injustice, and I found it difficult to identify with someone I would call a hero. We again find ourselves at a time of great political division in our country, and in these difficult times, I'm grateful to come to know exactly those qualities that I struggled to find in high school in the people who lead this project today. John Mellegrito with his soft-spoken yet fierce dedication to advocacy, Marie Blanco with her steadfast determination and resolve for justice, and of course, General Taguba with his exceptional leadership and dedication to telling this story. These are people I can count among my living heroes today, and it has been a great honor for me to work with them. I'd also like to thank the entire Night Kitchen team and our project partners for their dedication and hard work in bringing this story to life. So I'm proud to now share with you the Duty to Country Education Project. We begin with the introductory video displayed on this homepage.
Duty to Country tells the history of Filipinos' sacrifice and patriotism during World War II and their decades-long quest for recognition and justice after the war.
I think that oftentimes you get written out of history when you're not the one doing the writing.
World War II happened in many other places, and my grandma was one of those people who experienced that, and why have I never heard anything about the Philippines during the war?
No one talks about the Filipinos who were there, much less the fact that we took away their service afterwards. It's sort of a second-class kind of narrative about World War II.
If they rob you of your honor and betray you on the promise that was made to you, they don't pay you and then they discount you. That's hard. You know, it's tantamount to being non-existent.
The Duty to Country Education Project is dedicated to sharing the untold story of two nations, the United States and the Philippines, fighting under one flag. This ongoing project includes hours of oral history testimonies, a dynamic online exhibition, and profiles of key historical figures. Under One Flag begins with the colonial period, setting the stage and providing critical context. It recounts the stories of World War II in depth, from generals and privates to guerrillas and civilians, along with telling the larger story of the war in the Philippines through words, photographs, and documentary footage. It brings to life oral history testimonies through dynamic motion comics. The post-World War II era reveals the U.S. government rescinding its commitment to those who fought in the Philippines under our flag. The story continues through the contemporary period. For decades, Filipino Americans, veterans, and others have fought tirelessly all the way to the Supreme Court and into the halls of Congress for recognition, veterans' benefits, and rights of citizenship that had been denied to them. The Duty to Country Education Project features several hours of oral histories, first-hand accounts of living veterans, historians, and community advocates.
Why were Filipinos singled out? Among the 66 nations that were part of the Allied forces, Filipinos were singled out to be deprived of their rightful benefits. Why?
I thought it would be easy to get their benefit, but I found out as a USAPI veteran, you are a second-rate citizen.
Duty to Country aims to recognize these men and women for their service and to prompt all Americans to recognize these events as part of our shared history. And it seeks to empower a new generation of young people to reflect on what we owe our country and how we can ensure America fulfills its promises in the future.
I think most people, by and large, assume that we live in a country where a government does right by our people. Yet, when we uncover the story, it's a story that we need to remember so that we can remain vigilant.
That story is not going to be told unless we do this education project. And we committed ourselves to making sure that that story also becomes enshrined in American history, much like the Navajo Code Talkers, much like the Japanese American Nisei soldiers, much like the African Americans who fought during the Civil War, because this story is part of American history.
Below the introductory video, we now scroll through the homepage, where we showcase the Duty to Country project with a brief description, the online exhibition, Under One Flag, which I'll be exploring in a moment, and the oral histories, where we'll go now to showcase some of the updates we've made since a year ago. Starting with the Explore Topics page, featuring over a dozen different topics that aggregate over 100 different highlight clips from across many hours of oral history testimony. These short compilations of excerpts allow visitors unfamiliar with these stories to explore topics of interest and learn more about them. Each of these topical pages, such as the struggle for benefits, showcases a series of clips, displays links to the interviews they are excerpted from, and related topics to explore. These topical pages provide a number of different entrees into the oral history interviews. We'll go back for a moment to the Explore Interviews page, showcasing over a dozen different testimonies. For each of these individual sessions, we have added 5 highlight clips, again to provide visitors with multiple ways to engage in these dynamic stories. I encourage you to explore the individual interview pages, featuring a really wonderful wealth of content. Now I take you to the most comprehensive and dynamic aspect of the project, the online exhibition Under One Flag, America's Broken Promise to the Philippines. We begin with the landing page, which hints at the complex interconnected history of these two nations. We now enter the exhibition, opening up our main menu. Here, visitors can access the introduction, 4 chapters that span the history from the late 19th century to the present day, and a conclusion. We'll begin with the introduction. When you select a chapter, you can scroll down and explore in more depth the sections for that chapter. This chapter features the untold story, which provides an overview of the project. Each section begins with an animated illustration. Our dynamic, thoughtful script, written by historian Chris Capizzola, is paired with hundreds of archival images and relevant highlights from our oral history testimonies, such as this.
Why should Americans care about this piece of history? Because I think it complicates what is otherwise a sort of romanticized notion about World War II, right? I think most Americans don't realize that World War II in the Pacific was not simply about Japanese aggression, that it was about which empire, the United States or Japan, was going to have imperial control, that it wasn't about Japanese aggression, and it wasn't simply won by the U.S. commitment to democracy, right? There is a story about geopolitics and power here that I think looking at this Philippine story helps us sort of come to terms with, right? We really can't understand the history of World War II in the ways that I think popular narratives have framed it so far.
We also have included a range of maps, dozens of clips from the numerous documentaries produced on this topic over the years by filmmakers such as Sonny Azon, and bold text callouts. There are documents of note such as the Rescission Act of 1946, and photographs through to the contemporary day.
This is not just a Filipino thing. This is actually an American story. This is not just a Filipino story of a bunch of, brown men, taking up guns, to fight the Japanese. But that's the narrative that we've been told. So that's why it was easy to dismiss them. But this is actually an American story. And it's important for the American people, and this is why they saw the dignity and honor that comes with participating and supporting these efforts, that they have as much at stake as Filipinos do in ensuring that these Filipino veterans, their story is enshrined in American history.
The introduction goes on to present the 4 chapters: the colonial period, World War II, post-war, and all the way through to the contemporary period. One of my favorite aspects of the exhibition is that the menu acts as a high-level timeline. You can scroll through the sections of each chapter to get a bird's-eye view of the story. We begin the colonial period with building a nation in the late 19th century. Then into the turn of the century with the Philippine-American War. Next, we focus on America's colonial presence through the 1930s. Chapter 2, The Crucible of War, covers from 1934 to 1945. It begins with the road to war, which takes us up to attack and invasion, those fateful hours of December 7th and 8th, 1941, on to the battles of Bataan and Corregidor, and the infamous Death March. We then explored Japanese occupation from 1941 to 1945, and then revisit that time period, exploring the experiences of the guerrillas. I'm going to take a moment to jump into this section as you could with any section, to learn more. As I mentioned before, we begin each section with a call-out quote and a dynamic presentation of our illustration. We showcase our script alongside historic photographs, profile cards, oral history testimonies, and one of the most dynamic aspects of the exhibition, animations that bring our oral histories to life.
Ang takot ng mga panahon yun hindi ko nararamdaman.
Messenger for the guerrillas. When I signed on to join the guerrillas, they made me a runner, a messenger. During that time, I was fearless. The Japanese posted sentries around the town perimeter, but I was free to come and go as I pleased. To them, I was just an 11-year-old boy. My job was to get information, to relay letters back and forth between the guerrillas. My horse was my cover. Outfitted with coconuts and more, Yameru! We looked like we were fresh from the fields. But under the saddle, the real harvest was hidden, and I made sure it got into the right hands.
Sa bayan, ito dali mo doon sa etong balita.
We move on again, providing more archival photographs drawn from our deep research, working together with our historians. Showcase our profile cards, and then bring to life other oral history testimonies.
One of the most interesting things that there's a number of women who participate in this resistance movement.
Women of the resistance. It's estimated that 1 out of 10 Philippine guerrillas was a woman. Remarkably, many of these brave women were not only nurses and spies, but commanders of troops and entire regiments. Remedios Gomez Paraiso, a.k.a. Commander Liwayway, wore her red lipstick into battle as she commanded a squadron in the Hukbalahap. Refusing to retreat, she was twice captured and released by the Japanese. Valeria Yai Panlilio concealed military intelligence in her radio broadcasts and helped coordinate the resistance in Manila. After attracting the attention of Japanese intelligence, Panlilio fled to the mountains. There, with her future husband, Major Marcos Agustin, she led an army of guerrillas. Josefa Capistrano founded the Women's Auxiliary Service, a group of more than 3,000 strong who nursed the wounded and spied on the enemy. Magdalena Leones was the first Filipina to receive the U.S. Silver Star for smuggling radio parts and intelligence through enemy territory. Tragically, the U.S. refused to recognize most of these brave women warriors. Only registered nurses were put on their roster, and the vast majority of female guerrillas were unable to claim benefits despite promises made.
It's not a simple question of they were fighting for one country or the other. Both those countries were wrapped up together, and they've remained that way in the decades since.
I'll scroll through this section a bit more to show you just a few of the amazing photographs that we have collected for this project. So we move on now to October 1944, Liberation. And then on to the last chapter of World War II, Devastation and Victory, taking us through to September of 1945. Next, our shortest yet most critical chapter, Chapter 3, Promises Made, Promises Broken. This walks us through Philippine Independence Day in 1946 and highlights the promises made to Filipinos of rights and benefits for their service, just like any other GI fighting under the American flag. And then the fateful document of 1946, the Rescission Act, revoking those benefits. Chapter 4, The Long Road to Equity, covers the period from 1946 to the present. Decades of the ongoing struggle in the American courts, the influx of a new Filipino-American community in the 1970s and 80s, and legislative efforts in the 1990s. Few gains led to frustrations, with the greatest generation taking to the streets in the late 90s and early 2000s. We underscore bittersweet victory of the Equity Fund of 2009, and then the Congressional Gold Medal of 2017. And finally, we come to the conclusion: the fight continues. Before I explore this section, I'd like to take a moment to show you some of the other features of the site, including the menu that allows you to jump to any section, and media pages that gather together the animations throughout the exhibition, some of which I'll show you now.
One time, we were told to gather at the Sunken Garden, just in front of Manila City Hall.
Against the wall. When Manila was declared an open city, my ROTC unit dodged strafing runs by Japanese planes to dynamite trains, railways, and bridges. We opened up supply depots, distributing radios, medical supplies, and rice to the people to keep it out of the hands of the enemy. Soon after they took control, the Japanese lined up all the government employees against a wall. We were told that half of us would be let go. We took a test to see who would stay on. I failed mine on purpose. I was no collaborator. Those who passed were shipped to the front at Bataan. I never saw them again. After I was let go, I hid my sidearm, a Colt 45, in the sewer and went into hiding. I made contact with an underground resistance and began training recruits for the guerrillas.
So I stayed in Manila, and I joined a guerrilla army.
The story that my dad told me and I grew up with was that he was in the march going on his way to, I think it was Capas Tarlac. And then him and two other people were like, we're gonna escape.
Escape from Bataan. My grandfather, a Yusufe medic, was one of the 80,000 Filipino and American servicemen captured in Bataan. Most were sick and hungry. Many were wounded. The Japanese forced them to march more than 60 miles in the extreme heat. After days of endless walking, there came an opportunity to escape a nearly impenetrable sugarcane grove along the road. While the guards were distracted, he and two of his comrades made a break for it. Bullets flying after them, they plowed through the razor-sharp sugarcane. It cut their skin to ribbons, but they made it through. Others tried to follow, but the guards shot them down. A mad scramble brought them up on the edge of a river. To reach safety, they had to cross it, but one of them could not swim. Under threat of capture, they stopped and built a raft to carry him across. Half drowned, the three men escaped into the mountains. Many others weren't so lucky. Almost 20,000 men would perish on that long march to the prison camp.
And there were some other people after they tried to run away who tried to follow. They tried to escape too, but of course they didn't make it.
Nung ako'y guerrilla, ang ibig sabihin ko yun nung ako'y kumasa ako daw mga guerrilla, informer.
Under the hood. The Makapili were collaborators. They identified members of the resistance to the enemy. To protect his own identity, the Makapili put a straw bag over his head. The Japanese would line up the villagers, and the Makapili would point out the guerrillas. As one of the youngest guerrillas, it was my job to spy on the Makapili. I could go after him unseen and unheard as he slipped into the jungle. He could not know that he was being followed. My life depended on it. When he thought he was safe, that no one was around, he removed the bag. and I saw his face.
Bago ikukun ngayon namin sa tatransfer namin sa mga guerrilla. Yeah. Yan ang nangyayari.
Even back then, there was a lot of fake news going around. So my dad's job was to report to the Filipino people.
During the occupation, the Japanese waged a propaganda war in the Philippines. My father produced The Liberator, an underground newspaper that exposed their lies. The Liberator reported troop movements and Allied victories. It boosted morale and encouraged Filipinos to join the resistance. Hidden in the jungle, the writers had limited equipment and made ink from bark and berries. They ran the generator at night and relocated every few days to stay ahead of the enemy. Once copies were printed, they had to get them into the hands of their readers. My uncle smuggled The Liberator, posing as a bread delivery boy. Anyone caught with an anti-Japanese publication faced torture or even death. Once, when he was making his rounds, his contact saw him approaching and began to shout, "No bread today!" My uncle walked past, not daring to breathe until he made it out of the village. Sometimes, as many as 500 people shared a single copy. The Liberator was one of the few papers to survive until the end of the war.
His newspaper was so well produced, the Japanese never thought that they were publishing anything other than Manila.
Tapos ay titingnan natin kung saan naputok. At kung saan naputok, at kung siya, yun na titirahin.
Forged under fire. During the U.S. evacuation, our forces were pinned down at a church in Manaoag. A Japanese machine gunner hiding in the woods opened fire on us. I placed a sweet potato onto the barrel in front of me and watched the clearing. The machine gun rattled, revealing its position. I looked to my sergeant for orders, but he had vanished. So I picked up the smoking pieces of my lunch and said, "Listen up! We have to take out that gun if we are going to survive." I ordered the men to run in groups of 2 and lay suppressing fire as we advanced. We ran fast in a zigzag pattern, dodging bullets and staying low. I fired my carbine at the Japanese as I sprinted for cover. Bullets ripped through our lines as we inched closer to their position. Finally, we got within range. Through our weight of fire, we silenced the guns. The field went quiet. We all stood up, and the men looked to me. I was 16 years old. I asked, "Where is the sergeant? My coward sergeant?" We found him drinking coffee back at the camp.
Hindi, pagkakita, doon na ako ng punteriya sa nagkikistori. Hindi pa ko napapatigil. Pagtigil, tilisan na lang kung puputok pa. Ay hindi na. At tingin na malamang na patay na yun.
I thought it will be easy to get their benefit, but I found out as a USAPI veteran, you are a second-rate citizen.
Benefits denied. Promised that we would have the same benefits granted to any GI. But in 1946, Congress passed the Rescission Act. It blocked us from claiming citizenship, health care, and education. When I tried to immigrate to the United States, my application was repeatedly denied. In 1990, over 40 years later, an immigration bill gave me a new opportunity to apply for citizenship. I applied, and twice more, I was denied. On my third try, I was able to join my son in America. I became an activist and urged the government to fulfill the promises made to my fellow veterans. 20 years after I arrived, the equity bill made some of us eligible for a payment. Yet again, I was denied. My lawyer was able to prove I had been left off the US-recognized guerrilla roster. Finally, after several years of resubmitting documents, I was approved for a payment in October of 2017. It was a start. Almost a century has passed since World War II. This year, I turn 103 years old, and the Rescission Act is still in place.
Old soldiers never die. They just fade away.
It's important because they are part of history.
America is in the heart. I often accompanied my father, a Filipino veteran wounded in World War II, to visit the VA office in DC, where he would apply for health care benefits. He was always rejected. A retired VA claims officer confided to me that many Filipinos' documents were stamped with racial slurs and rejected out of hand. Other Filipino veterans shared similar stories. We took up their cause alongside them, and we began protesting in the streets. When I told my father I had enlisted in their struggle, he was proud. He said, "Well, it's about time, son." My father would join me at many of our protests. Being amongst his brethren in solidarity gave him hope. Our numbers grew. The American Legion, the VFW, and others lobbied for us in Congress as we protested in the streets. In 1990, after decades of demonstrations, there was a hearing about veterans' health care in the House. Hundreds of veterans attended. They believed America would not betray them. But Bob Stump, a constant foe in our fight, blocked the bill from reaching the floor. As he left the chamber, veterans flooded in. Spontaneously, they began singing, "God Bless America." They still believed America would do the right thing.
It would be a miscarriage of justice not to acknowledge the role that these Filipino veterans played during the war.
I worked with the staff in coming up with an immigration bill.
Equity at last. As a member of Senator Inoe's staff, I worked on immigration cases for Philippine veterans. I brought the rising number of cases to his attention, and we began to craft legislation to address the injustices done to these veterans. Our first victory came in the early 90s. We ushered through a bill allowing veterans to be naturalized as citizens. But progress was slow. Every Congress for 18 years voted down our bills for veterans' benefits. In 2009, we were close to passing a provision to provide benefits payments to veterans. But Republican senators, including John McCain, argued against it. I called Senator Inoue to ask if he needed any help. "No, I've got this," he told me. I love America, and I am proud of this country. But this is a black chapter. These men served us well. They died for us. They got wounded for us, and they deserve recognition. The bill passed. 4 years later, as vice chair of FilVet Rep, I helped pass another bill to award Filipino veterans official recognition. In 2016, with over 380 co-sponsors, we passed the Congressional Gold Medal Act.
Not many people know what the contributions that the Filipino veterans provided, but a lot of people need to know.
There are several other animations I encourage you to watch. Our project also features 30 dynamic profile cards designed by our fantastic illustrator, Aria Villafranca, capturing many of the dynamic personalities in the story. Of course, there are many that we couldn't create cards for, but we selected several of the key figures who play a role in the history of the Filipino veterans and explore their stories in more detail. These biographies, written by our historian, Colleen Woods, focus on how these people, some of whom are household names and many lesser known, played a role in this story. We showcase not only the heroes of our story, but some who might be considered villains for being on the wrong side of history in relation to the plight of Filipino veterans, including, for example, Carl Hayden, the primary proponent of the Rescission Act. Of course, we also have cards that reflect our own living heroes. John Melagrito, Filvet Rep Secretary, Marie Blanco, Vice Chair of Filvet Rep, and of course, we can't forget our fearless leader, General Taguba, Chairman of Filvet Rep. Finally, I'd like to show you the illustrations page. This gathers together all of the illustrations that act as section headers throughout our exhibition and allows visitors to explore them in more detail here and really enjoy the range and depth of how our illustrator brought the stories to life visually. We return now to our concluding chapter, The Fight Continues, in which our historian Chris Capizzola captures the key takeaways from this project. We showcase some of our closing oral history highlights and explore some thoughts for the future. I'll leave you with those final words from Filipino veteran Celestino Almeida, echoing those made famous by General MacArthur in his farewell address to Congress.
Old soldiers never die. They just fade away.
In closing, I'd like to thank the Filvet Rep team once again for inviting us to collaborate with them on this project, the Night Kitchen team and our project partners for all their hard work and dedication. I look forward to the next phase of this project when we can collaborate to bring more of this amazing story to life. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Matt Fisher and Night Kitchen Interactive. Seeing those fascinating animations and searing images of war makes me think of my dad and his 270,000 comrades whose stories we have enshrined for posterity. For our next presentation, Dr. Colleen Woods, Associate Professor in the University of Maryland's Department of History, will share with us other aspects of the project that we are still working on. Along with Chris Capizzola, Dr. Woods has been a valuable member of our hard-working academic advisory team from the outset. And like Professor Capizzola, she has also published a book which came out recently entitled Freedom Incorporated, American Imperialism and Philippine Independence in the Age of Decolonization. Dr. Woods.
So as John said in his opening remarks, our first priority when Filvet Rep began over 7 years ago was to gain recognition for the service and sacrifices of World War II veterans with the awarding of the Congressional Gold Medal. But we did not think of recognition as a one-time event. Instead, from the beginning, the Filvet Rep team set our vision on creating an educational platform that would incorporate the stories of Filipino vets into the broader history of the United States and the Philippines. It has really been an honor to work and be part of the Filvet Rep team. And I think I can speak for all of us when we say we are very proud of what we've accomplished with Under One Flag. But we are not done yet. Over the next year, we will supplement the digital exhibit by expanding our educational program in order to provide resources for teachers who want to integrate the Filipino-American story into their curriculum. Our curriculum development team will create lesson plans and activities that align with curriculum standards, making it easier for teachers to bring primary sources, oral histories, and the Under One Flag digital exhibit into the classroom and to engage students in the story of Filipino and American veterans. The history of Filipino-American veterans is not simply
a story about World War II. It's a story that intersects with major themes in US history, including immigration, civil rights, social movements, politics, and US foreign policy. This breadth will be reflected in a primary source document archive that will provide educators a repository of digitized documents related to the experiences of Filipino veterans, grassroots activists, and the legislative process. In order to help educators and students engage directly with primary sources, we will create a series of lesson plans and activities that will provide historical context and prompts for reflection. Finally, our team is also working on creating a graphic novel and a documentary film, two pieces of the educational program that can be used in the classroom, but will also, we hope, reach a broader public. Under One Flag is not the culmination of PhilVetRep's effort to recognize Filipino veterans. It's just one part of an ongoing effort to ensure that their stories are not forgotten.
Thank you very much, Dr. Woods. Now for our closing presentation, Attorney Seth Watkins, who teaches at Duke and Catholic universities, and also a member of our academic advisory team, will now briefly walk us through the history of the Guerrilla Recognition Program and the consequences from 1946 until today. Attorney Watkins.
Not all Filipino guerrilla forces were organized and operating in a manner that ultimately gained recognition by the U.S. Army. Yet, recognition was essential. Being deemed a member of a recognized unit became critical to eligibility for United States veterans' benefits. There were many injustices during the recognition program for Filipino guerrillas. Rosters of guerrillas had been either destroyed or lost. Some units did not even maintain complete and accurate rosters during the war, for fear of the consequences if the rosters fell into enemy hands. So after the war ended, the U.S. Army undertook the task of reconstructing the rosters and recognizing only those guerrilla forces they deemed worthy. A previously secret report prepared by the United States Army in 1949 chronicles the Army's somewhat haphazard preparation of the reconstructed rosters. The report discloses that when it was determined that the unit was worthy of recognition, the unit commander was directed to screen his unit down in numbers. The reasoning behind screening was that the unit would be incorporated into the Philippine Army as a standard unit. And the arbitrariness of the recognition process is readily apparent from a decision that, accepting registered nurses, no women should be recognized. As it turned out, the unfamiliarity of American personnel with the spelling of female names in Spanish and in native dialect permitted the recognition of just a small number of other women. Even the commander of over 40,000 guerrilla troops in the northern Philippines during World War II, Lieutenant Colonel Edwin P. Ramsey, disclosed years later that he participated in the reconstruction of the rosters after the war, but nearly half of the Filipinos who served under his command, even including some who served on his own staff, were de-recognized by the Army for political reasons, and their records eliminated. The recognition program capriciously ended on June 30th, 1948, a date established by Congress by which U.S. funds appropriated in 1946 for supporting the Philippine Army had to be used. In August of 1949, Philippine President Quirino personally lobbied President Truman for the U.S. to still recognize additional Philippine guerrillas. But President Truman said the issue was closed as far as the United States was concerned. Many Filipinos have existed in a state of legal limbo vis-a-vis U.S. veterans' benefits for nearly 75 years since they served. Once the recognition program was closed in 1948, the U.S. government refused to make any additions to the rosters. The U.S. Army Board for the Correction of Military Records took the official position in 1951, again in secret, that it would not consider any requests from Filipinos still seeking recognition for their service. That decision stood until 2019, when in an about-face, the Army Board announced in a court proceeding that it actually would start considering any requests from purported Filipino guerrillas. By that point, the damage long had been done. Most were dead. Even those Filipinos who World War II service was recognized experienced a notorious bait and switch. Initially, they were told by the VA that they were in active service for the purposes of U.S. veterans benefits. But then Congress passed the first Rescission Act of 1946, which essentially stripped Filipinos of U.S. veterans benefits. So-called Philippine Scouts were similarly disenfranchised by the second Rescission Act of 1946. To the extent Filipinos still were eligible for the payment of pensions due to service-connected disability or death, they were only to be paid at the rate of 1 Philippine peso for each dollar authorized to be paid. While Filipino Veterans Equity Compensation, created in 2009, provided some measure of closure for some Filipino veterans as a token demonstration of their service being valued by the U.S., 56% of those who applied for this one-time U.S. veterans benefit have been denied it. And even for those who received this benefit of either $9,000 or $15,000 in lieu of the 75 years of payments of veterans benefits that had been avoided by the U.S., there was a catch. The compensation was made in exchange for a complete legal release of any claim against the U.S. by reason of any service. This unsavory story of Filipino veterans seeking recognition and respect and being denied it at virtually every turn cannot be forgotten. Indeed, we must expose it and learn from it. Many Filipinos' personal quests for recognition of their service by the United States remained unfulfilled since the end of World War II. Many died before winning the battle for recognition. Some, a constantly shrinking number who are still alive, continue to fight. Thank you.
Thank you for that enlightening presentation, Attorney Watkins. You have made an important point that in trying to secure justice for our veterans, advocates face many roadblocks to success. Now that you have seen Duty to Country, which is a work in progress, I hope you are as thrilled and excited as I am in sharing this one-of-a-kind experience that chronicles the untold stories of colonialism, World War II, post-war, and the contemporary period. So, what's next? As we said earlier, Duty to Country is a work in progress. General Taguba will now walk us through the next phases of this education program. General?
The principal objective of Duty to Country project is to reach the classrooms in elementary schools, in high schools, colleges, and universities by 2021. We want to reach out to cultural and historical organizations and institutions. Some of you are with us this evening who may be willing to exhibit and use it for educational purposes. We want this to be available and accessible online to the American public. We will also make it accessible and available to students and educational institutions in the Philippines. They are very much involved in this project. We will have public relations campaign to reach out to communities and conduct public engagements, virtually and in person when possible, and include media and digital outreach. We will promote Duty to Country as an educational opportunity, an investment to educate our students and our community and the American public. All this will take more time and more resources to accomplish and to continue to integrate additional content in the project over a period of time, and sometimes we think about 5 more years. Now, Duty to Country is funded entirely with the enormous generosity of our corporate and private sponsors, our public donations to include matching funds. Our fundraising strategy is to seek corporate and organizational support through private donations and matching funds through digital marketing, virtual fundraising, in-person fundraising once COVID goes away. PhilVet Rep is a producer of Duty to Country. It is an IRS-approved tax-exempt nonprofit organization. Every single dollar we raise goes to the education fund. We are all volunteers and are not paid in salary or benefit. At the bottom of the Duty to Country page, acknowledgement section, is a donation bar for you to help support this education project. And we wish you to support this incredible project for years to come. Of course, we realize it is extremely difficult during this dire pandemic period to raise funds. Our topmost priority for all of you is to stay healthy, to stay safe, and be financially stable during this time. I also want to thank the entire project team, especially Matthew Fisher and Night Kitchen, for producing an incredibly powerful and compelling virtual education program. To the living veterans and family members who told us their stories, and to the Board of Directors of the Filipino Veterans Recognition and Education Project. And a very special thanks to our generous sponsors, hundreds of donors for their financial support, for their exceptional generosity and patience to avail us to present Duty to Country Part 1. My personal thanks, or my personal ask is this: please join us on this worthy mission. Spread the word of Duty to Country, a broken promise. Now, before I turn it over to John, I want to acknowledge a few of our many remaining guests. Mr. Terry Shima, a living World War II veteran. Lieutenant General Lee Quintas, United States Army. Lieutenant General Ed Soriano, United States Army retired. Major General Tony Aguto, United States Army. Rear Admiral Mel Chioji, U.S. Navy retired. Major General Jason and Mrs. Carmen Camilla, U.S. Army retired. Brigadier General John and Mary Beth Brown, United States Army, and a published military historian in his own right. And Brigadier General Oscar Hillman, U.S. Army retired. Thank you. So back to you, John.
Thank you, General, and to our team, Professor Capazola, Dr. Woods, Attorney Watkins, and Matt Fisher of Night Kitchen Interactive and his team. We also want to thank our many generous donors and sponsors, without whose help this project would not have been possible. Thank you. We can't thank you enough for your generosity. And of course, we are ever grateful to our veterans and their families who have shared their inspiring stories, encouragement, and who gave us a compelling reason to preserve their memories for posterity. Good night, friends.